Here we are above the village of Whalley on Whalley Nab, and in the far distance, if it was a bit clearer, we could see the mountain of Ingleborough, one of the famous three peaks. Now, we're going to take a trip, and we're going from the other side of Ingleborough back here to Whalley Nab. Hi, here we are, apparently stood in the middle of nowhere, actually on a moor in North Yorkshire. Now, John Byng came through here in 1792, and we are following in his footsteps. He came from over in that direction, which is Askrigg, over the tops to here, Ribblehead. And what do we have just over there but the famous Ribblehead Viaduct? We first discovered Byng riding his horse Ranger along what was then just a rough track and dropping down onto the Gearstones Inn, which he charmingly describes as a sea of misery in a desert. It was surrounded by hundreds of shaggy horned cattle, for it arrived at the time of the Scotch Fair, Highlanders having driven their herds down from Scotland. The inn was crammed by the buyers and sellers, most of whom were in plaids and fillybegs, etc., so he says. After forcing his way in, Byng procured some broiled slices of stale pork and some fried eggs, with some wretched beer and brandy, to all which my hunger was not equal, and from which my delicacy revolted. Byng writes, "The Scotch are always wrapped up in their plaids, as defence against heat, cold or wet, but they prevent speed or activity. So whenever any cattle strayed, they instantly threw down the plaid, that they might overtake them." The image of bare-buttock Scotsmen running about the Dales isn't really something that I want to dwell on. He continued along the road that now passes Ribblehead Viaduct. Of course, that wonderful feat of Victorian engineering wasn't constructed till some 80 years after Byng. But it's too good a monument for us to ignore, and even more spectacular when there's a steam engine crossing it. Let's have a little music. In the year of 69, they planned to run a train from Settle to Carlisle all across the mountain range. They employed 3,000 navvies to build this mighty road, and across the fells to Appleby that old steam engine rolled. And it's up in the morning, lads, in wind, snow and hail. Hold fast to your hammers, lads, and lay another rail. Even if railways had been available in Byng's day, I don't think he would have used them. Most people from his social class, the upper classes, would have travelled by chaise or fighting coach, but he loved the outdoors and exercise, and to travel on horseback, not to miss anything of interest on his way. He now visited Chapel le Dale, mentioning St Leonard's. There's a connection with our last point of interest here, as many of the dead from the building of the Settle Carlisle Railway are buried here. But his main reason for coming was some quarter of a mile away, in the grounds of Weathercote House. Weathercote's Cave had first been described by one Richard Pocock in 1751 as one of the most extraordinary and surprising scenes I've ever beheld, and by Byng's day had become a must-see if you were travelling in this part of Yorkshire. Byng records the Weathercote Cascade as falling with an horrid din, filling the mind with a gloom of horror. J.M.W. Turner sketched and painted here a few years after Byng, as shown in this postcard. In the terms of the day, this was the sublime, as put forward by Edmund Burke in 1757. He defined the sublime as that which would produce the strongest emotions the mind is capable of feeling. He wrote, "Whatever is in any sort terrible or operates in a manner analogous to terror is a source of the sublime." In landscape, the sublime is exemplified by Turner, but the notion that it was a legitimate function of artists to produce upsetting or disturbing effects was an important element in romantic art of the day and remains fundamental to art today. Byng's 1792 was right on the cusp of the romantic movement, as exemplified by the likes of William Wordsworth, who published his first collection of poetry just 1 year later. From Weathercoats and Chapel-le-Dale, Byng, with a local chap for a guide, now set off over the watershed into Kingsdale and Breda Garth Farm, for he had another natural wonder to see. We, however, are going to take a lovely unclassified road around. The search for the sublime drove, in part, a tourist boom in the second half of the 18th century, within the moneyed classes at least. There was an appreciation of the great outdoors. Tour writing was becoming something of a fashion, and a number of books covered this part of our trip, especially as it was on, or just off, the main trade route between York and Lancaster, and on the way to the Lake District. But they didn't cover the second part of this trip, which will take Byng through the Ribble Valley. 49-year-old ex-Colonel John Byng is an unusual traveller. He's had a career in the 1st Foot Guards and is now an official of the Stamp Office of the Inland Revenue, and thus has to live in London. But he despises the crowding and the society of the capital, preferring the countryside, and each year makes his escape. His Stamp Office position must have been something of a sinecure for him to absent himself for these 2 or 3 months at a time. But from 1782 to 1793, we have details of his annual trips. His tour to the north is his 8th fully recorded ride. Now here we are going down to the home of the giant Yordas Cave. Byng came here, very impressed by it. He'd come over the tops over by Breda Garth, which we'll see shortly. And inside it is very impressive. It became a show cave in Victorian times. We should really have hard hats to go in, but this cap will have to do. We have it rather better than visitors such as Byng with our powerful electric torches, and the full grandeur of the cave is clear and immediate. The pièce de résistance, though, is down a narrow passage, sloshing through the stream bed, into the aptly named Chapter House, where a dramatic waterfall enters at high level. Back in the main cave, we can see some of the strange formations that the guides of the past gave anthropomorphic names to. A ram's head, though I can't see it, and then the giant himself, a mass of flowstone that is his chainmail, with his roaring face at the top. Right, now then, we've come about a mile down the road from Yordas Cave. We're still on the hillside of Gragreth, and we're here to see this, an oil drum sunk into the hillside. Now this is Valley Entrance, the entrance to Kingsdale Master System, the system of caves that runs for miles under where we are. It's absolutely incredible. This wasn't known to Byng, of course. This has only been here since about 1960s. And 40 years ago or so, I did this cave. But no, I'm not going to do it today. It was Monday, June the 18th, 1792, that Byng arrived here in Ingleton. He found accommodation at the Bay Horse Inn. That no longer exists. A modern shop takes its place further up in the town. He said, though, it was of most neat and comfortable appearance without, and so I found it within. The following day, the Tuesday, was a cold, blustering morn, nor was I in haste to arise. But he did arise, and he went for a long walk. And on his way back, he came and stopped on the very bridge that we can see just behind us. It's actually two bridges, one of each crosses a stream. And on that bridge he met a fellow, sensible, I thought, as speaking my sentiments, for to my insidious enquiry, if the cotton trade did not benefit the poor, he answered, "The worst thing in the world, in my opinion, sir, for it will leave us neither stout husbandmen nor modest girls, for the children bred in a cotton mill never get exercise or air, and all are impudent and saucy." It's a bit of a stretch to accept that the blame for breeding immodest and saucy girls should be added to the charge sheet of the cotton industry, but along with enclosure of common lands during the 18th century, it did move people off the land and self-sufficiency into the growing towns and cities, with the aforementioned reduction of exercise and fresh air. Byng is something of an antiquary. He's for rural life and often looks back to what he sees as gentler times. From his other tours we see him deploring the grubbing up of hedges to create larger fields, the wholesale felling of timber, the tearing down of old buildings, things that we are very conscious of today. He's against the loss of stout husbandmen and the move away from agriculture. He sees that the country is becoming less self-sustaining, noting that already wheat and corn is having to be imported from the Americas. With the Industrial Revolution came the point at which food security, producing enough to meet domestic needs, of Great Britain was irretrievably lost. Look at Ingleton today, and what do you see? A place supporting tourism? An outdoor-centric centre? That's certainly the aura that surrounds it. But things aren't as they first seem. From well before Byng's day, it was in fact an industrial town. The first cotton mill arrived in 1791, but there had been a corn mill here for at least 100 years before. Coal was mined here for 400 years, right through to 1940. Associated with the coal seam was fire clay and pottery clay, which supported brickmaking and a pottery. Limestone had been quarried here since time immemorial. There's still a huge quarry on the edge of town. And relics from that former industrial past are scattered about, if you care to look for them. Here's a quirky fact. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's mother lived nearby for the last 30 years of her life, and Arthur was a regular visitor. He wrote his first Sherlock Holmes novel, A Study in Scarlet, in 1887. In the draft of the novel, the hero was originally called Sherringford Holmes, and this was only changed to Sherlock at the last moment. So is it just a coincidence that the architect of the recently rebuilt Ingleton Parish Church was a Mr Sherlock? The incumbent of St Mary's was a Reverend Sherlock. The Reverend Sherlock's father was killed in a lightning strike on Ingleton Station, the very station that Conan Doyle used when visiting his mother, and that there's a stained glass window to his memory in the church tower. We can't be certain, but to me the deduction is elementary. Byng made a few excursions while he was here at Ingleton. Let's just look at one of them. He ascended part of what is now labelled the Waterfalls Walk, that attracts thousands each year now, and then dropped down to a nearby hamlet. On Tuesday, June the 19th, 1792, John Byng was here in the little hamlet of Thornton in Lonsdale. And he mentions this church, and he says, nearly opposite Thornton Church style is a public house of neat appearance. And here is the very public house, the Martin Arms, looking as lovely as ever and just as John Byng would have seen it. Now, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was actually married in this church over here. And where do you think he had his wedding breakfast? In this very pub. Cue for a drink, Martin. Come on. As we leave Ingleton, we pass the site of Byng's Inn and then exit the town by what is now almost a back street. His exit was to what was then the Turnpike Road, now designated as the Old Road towards Settle. It's a great benefit to us that the A65, which didn't exist in Byng's day, now takes the majority of traffic. We, despite travelling at speeds unheard of by Byng, can enjoy the scenery, our road running roughly along the 750-foot contour line, according to the old Ordnance Survey maps. For Byng, the country was pleasant, but the weather very cold. Luckily, however, Ingleborough served for a screen to keep off the wind. He's probably right that the mountain is a windbreak, but for the first few miles out of town, it simply can't be seen, the road hidden between typical dry stone walls and parts screened by trees. The view to our right reaches out towards the Lancashire coastal plain. We're passing a few old farms that Byng must have seen, including the photogenic Holly Platt farm, whose main building was old even in Byng's day, but he makes no comment, riding briskly on. We're on part of the Keighley-Kendal Turnpike, this road being built in 1753, following an ancient route through Craven. Despite being a minor road today, this highway was part of the movement that revolutionised traffic in the 18th century. The Turnpike Trusts, allowing tolls to be levied for the upkeep and improvement of roads that in some cases had been barely passable, were bodies authorised by individual acts of Parliament. These toll roads existed into the middle of the 19th century, by which time the railway era was in full swing. The turnpikes spurred the growth of trade in the Industrial Revolution, but eventually these gated roads themselves were seen as a restriction on movement of goods. More about the turnpikes in due course. Except for the road surface, this narrow lane that brings us into the top of Clapham village was the main road. This was the Turnpike Road, and I think it really gives us the feel of how it was in Byng's day. Clapham is one of those ancient settlements that this country abounds in. It was already old when the Normans founded its church, but it's not always been as peaceful as it is now. Both village and church were burnt during a Scottish raid following their victory at the Battle of Bannockburn in the early 14th century. Well, Clapham's always been in Yorkshire, of course, but it has moved about a bit, from west to north riding. The de Claphams, who took their name from the village, fought on the side of the House of Lancaster in the Wars of the Roses. I think they must have been a little confused. From the 18th century, Clapham has been the home to the Farrer family, who established the Ingleborough estate that has sat above the village since Byng's time. The family still owns and is responsible for much of the land, walls, woods, fields and moors of the village, the surrounding countryside and its farms. The hall itself is now an outdoor education centre, I believe. Ingleborough Show Cave lies in the estate grounds, but not only have we already seen some of Yorkshire's underground, this wasn't an attraction until the 1830s, so we'll pass on. It's worth mentioning, though, that if you continue up past the Show Cave, through Trow Gill, and onto the high slopes of the mountain, you'll find Gaping Gill, the large hole that drops into one of the wonders of Yorkshire. If you should get there during either of the two annual caving club meets, when gear is set up for a descent, you'll be lowered down into an awesome cavern said to be big enough to fit York Minster. I've actually done it several times. Clapham has its celebrities. Reginald Farrar, 1880 to 1920, was a botanist who collected many species of rhododendron, shrubs and alpines in China and Tibet between 1914 and 1920. Many of these still grow on the estate. In some places it's said that he fired seeds at cliff faces from a shotgun to give a natural spread to his rock plants, which is an interesting method of dispersal. National treasure Alan Bennett still has a cottage here. One of his most famous plays is The Madness of King George III, and that is who was on the throne at the time of Byng's ride. In 1792, George III had ruled the country for almost 32 years and had already had the spell of mental illness that Bennett wrote about. That was in 1788. The disease that caused his madness has been labelled the hereditary porphyria, though this is still cause of debate. It wasn't till 1810 that he had his final relapse that led to the establishment of the Regency. Byng had an interesting and pithy comment to make about Clapham. He wrote, "Through Clapham, not near Westminster Bridge." William Pitt the Younger was King George's Prime Minister. It was a Tory government. Pitt's friend William Wilberforce was an MP already, but sat as an independent. He introduced his bill to abolish the slave trade in May 1789. The bill stalled. When it eventually came to a vote in April 1791, it was passed by the Commons but defeated by the Lords. Between 1792 and 1806, a number of further unsuccessful attempts were made to enact legislation to abolish the slave trade. Incidentally, back in 1787, the British settlement of Sierra Leone had been established in West Africa as a home for freed slaves. This wasn't a completely charitable act, though. It was intended to resettle some of the black poor of London, some of whom were African Americans freed by the British during the American colonial revolt that the US calls its War of Independence. That initial community of 500 people was almost entirely wiped out due to failed crops and disease in Sierra Leone. But in 1792, a further group of 1,100 people, who'd also fought for the British in the American War of Independence, left Nova Scotia to re-establish community of free black people there. The key international problem for Great Britain of 1792 was the French Revolution. Great Britain was deeply worried that its spirit would invade our shore. The Bastille had been stormed in 1789. By June 1791, the French royal family had fled Paris, and this year of Byng's ride saw their imprisonment. Less than 1 year later, Louis XVI was guillotined, followed 9 months later by his queen, Marie Antoinette. The spirit of revolution had been spurred on by Thomas Paine, British political theorist and activist, whose Rights of Man, advocating the right of people to overthrow their government, was published in 1791, with a second edition in 1792. Charged with sedition, Paine fled to France. The spirit of liberty, equality and fraternity that stemmed from the French Revolution inspired the establishment of radical societies in Britain. In January 1792, the London Corresponding Society, that advocated universal male suffrage, secret ballots, and annual parliaments, was formed. It was later banned as a seditious organisation. That doyen of women's movements, Mary Wollstonecraft, published her Vindication of the Rights of Women in 1792, and by the end of the year was in Paris, hoping that the revolution's implied promise of equality would be extended to women. It wasn't. Today, Wollstonecraft is regarded as one of the founding feminist philosophers, with her work often cited. But now back to the ride. After leaving Clapham, where he didn't even stop for a drink, Byng passed Orstwick, before following the road down past Giggleswick Scar and on to Settle, passing the ebbing and flowing well as he did so. Now looking more like a roadside drain than anything, this was something to see in Byng's day. Why it ebbed and flowed I don't know, and as it no longer does it, we can't find out. The road into Settle has changed out of all recognition, and it has been difficult to ascertain its exact route at Byng's time. But it did pass through Giggleswick, turned sharply right onto the bridge, and then right again after the bridge, and round via a long dogleg before debouching him into Market Square. There were several inns in and around the square, including the Royal Oak, still there. But it was market day, and the town was crowded with farmers. Byng could only find accommodation away from the square at the Spread Eagle. He says, after fetching a gratifying parcel of letters from the post office and procuring a newspaper, I sat down quietly to tea, for the weather was too bad for walking, when I saw the half-drunken farmers scampering home from market. Since the road improvements brought about by turnpikes, mail travelled via post coaches at the then high speed of 8 miles an hour. The very first mail coach, taking advantage of these improving roads, set out in 1784 on the London-Bristol route. Although there was already a penny post system within a few major cities, in country areas such as this, it was the recipient who still paid the postage, the cost depending on the distance travelled. We don't know which newspaper Byng purchased in Settle, but it might have been this edition of the Times. If so, he would have read of the first official British embassy setting off for China under Lord Macartney, or of a duel between the Earl of Lonsdale and a Captain Cuthbert, after Lonsdale called Cuthbert a rascal. Each fired a brace of pistols, no one was hurt, but Honour was satisfied. Byng thought Settle a poor, gloomy place, which might have been due to the weather, but the quality of his accommodation might also have had something to do with it. This is a bad and dismal inn, with the mice running about behind the wainscot, and everything rattling with the wind. Byng's Spread Eagle is now a bed and breakfast, so I expect the accommodation has much improved. He had an early dinner of beefsteaks, lamb chop, pickled salmon, and tart. The following day, with the weather still poor, and him feeling unwell, he says, "This morning I had the prudence not to rise till a hot shirt was brought to me, and then I crawled down to drink bowls of tea." Now, although we must presume this was leaf tea, we can't actually take that for granted, as more than once in his rides he refers to drinking fine basins of snail tea. Apparently, this unappetizing concoction was indeed made from snails, and thought to be effective for those suffering consumption or fever. I haven't mentioned it yet, but Byng was travelling with a manservant, Garwood, who often rode ahead to reserve rooms. Garwood had only recently entered Byng's employ, but was found to be much better than his previous valets. I'll tell you something of Byng's personal income later in this film, but let me just tell you a little about cash and banking in his time before we leave Settle. Because in 1791, the year before Byng's visit, a new bank was founded in Settle, the Craven Bank. Banking at this time was virtually unregulated, and anyone could open one, and they could issue their own banknotes. But banknotes were little used at this time, as the average annual pay of a working person was less than the amount of the smallest note, £5. Also at this time the notes were more like cheques, or, more precisely, promissory notes. I promised to pay the bearer on demand, etc., and had the recipient's name handwritten on the face. Here's a rather tatty Bank of England note from 1793, made out to Mr A.C. Newland. Mr. Newland could pass on the note for value, by signing it on the reverse and handing it over. But that depended on the recipient being happy that the bank on which it was drawn was solvent, and small regional banks had a habit of failing. Byng, being wealthy, might have carried a Bank of England note with him as a store of value to exchange for cash at some provincial bank, but he would have got nowhere without coins in his pocket. Incidentally, in the following century, the Craven Bank issued notes with a craven heifer on them, and local farmers liked them. They preferred their notes "with a cow on 'em" rather than Bank of England notes. The Craven Bank covered a small area of Yorkshire and East Lancashire and was a success story. It was later bought out by larger banks and disappeared. One thing of note as we exit Settle is the old Turnpike Toll House. Such buildings still exist all across the country, of course, and here a gate barred the road, so the toll had to be paid. If you were lucky enough to be able to afford a coach and four, the length of the Keighley Kendal Turnpike cost you 5 shillings. A drove of 20 cattle, 2 shillings. Because there were initially 5 toll bars, the amount taken at any one bar was not to exceed 1/5 of the end-to-end cost. Foot travellers were free, and no tolls were charged on the carriage of fuel, building materials or manure, on corn, cloth or wool being taken to a mill. No charges were made to residents going to church on Sunday, to the funeral of a neighbour, to vote in an election, or, of course, for the Royal Mail. The A65 still follows the Turnpike Road, and as Byng rode forward on a gloomy, forbidding day without pleasure, he noted another Scotch sale at the village of Long Preston, where I again attended to the different dialects and dress. And then he notes another construction at Gargrave. I crossed the new canal from Leeds to Liverpool, where they are building new locks for the advantage of increasing trade. The 127-mile-long Leeds-Liverpool Canal was started at both ends in 1777, but they ran out of money, and for about 15 years no construction was done. The Leeds section had finished here, and it was only in 1790 that they started building again. This is the full route of the canal, but it's not the route originally planned. Not only was it due to go to the north of Burnley, but there was to be a branch off to Clitheroe, where we'll be going shortly. That was never built. As Byng travels on to Skipton, let's look at a few interesting personalities who were born or died in 1792. Percy Bysshe Shelley, the poet, was born this year, as was William Henry Smith, who, with his wife, would set up W.H. Smith. I've already mentioned Richard Arkwright, inventor and mill owner, died this year, as did Sir Joshua Reynolds, prolific portrait painter and first president of the Royal Academy. Robert Adam, the architect, died. As did John Montagu, 4th Earl of Sandwich, ex-Lord of the Admiralty, and the originator of the fast food that bears his name. And Anna Snell, the famous female soldier.
I was in Yorkshire, and when I was 16, I ran away from home, me lads, and a soldier I became. With a fine cap and feathers, likewise a rattling drum, they learned her to play upon the rub-a-dub-a-dum.
This is an old folk song about a girl who disguises herself as a boy to join the army at a time when it was purely a man's preserve. There's a great line in it that says, "To think I lay with 1,000 men and a maiden all the while." Well, Anna was no maiden. She'd already been married, her husband ran off when she was pregnant, the child died in infancy, and then she borrowed a man's suit and enlisted. She served in Europe and India, was wounded in the groin, and still her secret was not revealed. She later published her autobiography, she appeared on stage, and she was a real celebrity of her day. We now carry on into Skipton with its wide main street. Incidentally, the Spencer of Marks and Spencer was born here in Skipton in 1851. One of the oldest mills in Yorkshire, High Corn Mill, has stood here since 1310, and by Byng's day there were already 4 textile mills in operation. Byng put up at the Black Horse, where he said he had a tolerable bed and passed a tolerable night. nor did I get up more than once to look at the weather. The next day opened fine, but by evening the rain had returned. Are the days now to shorten before summer has made many, and those but faint efforts? Queried Byng. He inquired at the post office for letters, only for the postmaster to state that several had arrived, but that fearful of losing the postage he'd sent them back, except one, franked, which he delivered to a Mr John Byng as the nearest sounding name. Here in Skipton, Byng mentions the church. He said, which reminds me much of Maidstone for some reason. And then he mentions about the castle. A servant maid showed us the castle, and a most inconvenient, miserable, tattered place it is, with neither beauty of building nor pleasing antiquity, but a melancholy wretchedness of bad old rooms, some miserable tapestries, and some basely neglected pictures, especially one of the Countess with a child in her hand, are the only relics, for all the furniture has been removed to Appleby Castle. Leaving Skipton and continuing to follow Byng along the old turnpike road, we're about to turn onto the present A59 when we see one of the many bits of road abandoned over time. These are very noticeable, presenting themselves as lay-bys or other cut-offs created by road widening or straightening over the years. The Parliamentary Act for creating the Skipton-Preston Turnpike Trust was passed in 1755. Byng was pleased to leave Skipton and be back on the road. I was glad to leave this dismal town and dismal inn, where I had been hoarse and unwell. He did say, though, that my eating here is charged cheaply. He'd stayed 3 days, making side trips to Malham and Goredale and Bolton Abbey, and it was now Saturday, 23rd of June, 1792. We are now passing Broughton Hall, Mr Tempest's seat, a shaded situation, with a stream in front which turns a mill below it, beautifully hid in wood. Elsewhere he'd said that the 3 things necessary for an ideal country house were a stream or river, good farmland, and extensive woods. This 3,000-acre estate, which has been in the hands of the Tempest family since 1097, had all 3. Like other country estates, it has had to diversify to survive. You can stay at the hall or in its grounds. It hosts various fairs and events. It has its own business park. The hall was extended in the 50 years following Byng's visit, and a conservatory added. When that conservatory had to be rebuilt, the family allowed its restorers, Oakleaf, to utilise the remade dome as a specially made conservatory for the 1992 Chelsea Flower Show. It was returned home after the event. Passing on to the village of East Marton, where, he says, the road becomes very stony and disagreeable, he had to take shelter under trees for half an hour to avoid a pelting storm. In Byng's remarks about the weather, I think we can recognise a fairly typical English summer. And then he took a short detour to view another country house, Gledstone House, a new-built staring house on a hill. The house that Byng saw no longer exists, but we're going to have a look at what remains. We drive through a landscape parkland to the Hall stables, a terrific building in its own right. A view from Google Earth not only shows the footprint of the demolished hall, but also the wonderful plan of the stables with its circular interior yard. Sir Amos Nelson, Lancashire mill owner, and whose family gave its name to the town just a few miles away, bought this estate in 1923. His descendant, David Nelson, has a house within this stable block and was most helpful in showing us his home and even providing a photograph of the original property, demolished in 1928. It was torn down as Sir Amos had had a new house built just a quarter of a mile away. The new Gladstone Hall is a listed masterpiece, a hidden gem designed as it was by Sir Edwin Lutyens, with gardens by Gertrude Jekyll. It's difficult to remember or visualise that this road, Byng's Turnpike, and now the A59, was one of the main east-west routes across the Pennines until the building of the M65. In the 1950s and 60s, Gisburn was a main stopping point for coaches taking trippers from the cities of West Yorkshire to the heady delights of Blackpool. On the left as we enter the village was a huge bar cafe with formica tables and a coach park. Houses stand there now. Byng merely passes through Gisburn, just noting that it's a small market town. Luckily for Gisburn, though originally in Yorkshire, it's now in Lancashire. In 1612, a village resident, Janet Preston, was tried as part of the Pendle witch trials, accused of causing the death of Thomas Lister by witchcraft. Her trial took place in York because the village then lay within Yorkshire. She was found guilty and was hanged there. She'd already appeared in court in 1611, accused of murdering a child by witchcraft, but had been found not guilty. Was Byng aware of the Pendle witches? He makes no reference to them, but as the most famous, or notorious, such trials in the country, they'd never been out of the public imagination since Thomas Potts, as court recorder, wrote up details of the trials in Lancaster as they happened. Pendle Hill has been visible to us for many miles. It might be just short of being a mountain, but it dominates the Ribble Valley. Oh Pendle, thou standest alone, 'twixt Burnley and Clitheroe, Whalley and Combe, where Hodder and Ribble's fair waters do meet, with barley and Downham content at thy feet. Pendle, oh Pendle, majestic sublime, thy praises shall ring to the end of all time. Thy beauty eternal, thy banner unfurled, thou'rt the dearest and grandest old hill in the world. Though when the witches do fly on a cold rainy night. Now we're at somewhere that Byng managed to miss completely, which is rather surprising as we're only a couple of hundred yards from the turnpike road that he used. But this is Sawley, or Sally, Abbey, and it was established in 1146 on land gifted by the Percy family, the great Northumberland family of the time. And I'm really surprised that Byng missed it, because it was known for a long time as the unluckiest abbey in England. The monks found the ground was marshy, climate inhospitable, and there were poor harvests making life difficult. The Percys stepped in again, gave more endowments, and the monks stayed put. But then, in 1296, Whalley Abbey, 9 miles from Sawley, was founded, and the two Cistercian houses immediately quarrelled over grain supplies and fishing rights on the River Ribble. Now Sawley was considered poorer than Whalley, and it suffered further from cruel and inhuman spoliation that accompanied Scottish raids about the year 1320, and also they suffered the expense of providing board and lodging to travellers, lying, as the abbey did, by a busy main road. It was noted for its scholarship, though. One of the monks here, William de Remington, went on to become Chancellor of the University of Oxford in 1372-3. In spring 1536, Sawley surrendered during Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries, but that autumn, during the Northern Rising, known as the Pilgrimage of Grace, the abbey was restored under a new abbot, William Trafford. The rebellion failed, and Trafford was hanged in Lancaster in March 1537, and the abbey immediately plundered of its valuables. Then, for the next 300 years, all the high-quality stone was taken and reused in neighbouring farms and cottages. The site is now owned by English Heritage. Well, here we are in Chatburn. Byng barely mentions it as he comes through, but we're outside the famous Hudson's ice cream store, and we're just trying to stop ourselves going in and treating ourselves to an ice cream. But this was one of the toll booths on the old Turnpike Road, and just at the side here you can perhaps see a little window in the wall, and that is part of the original toll booth. As Byng rode down into the village, he had a choice of roads to take. If he'd chosen the left-hand option, which was the Turnpike Road, he would have bypassed Clitheroe. We tend to think of bypasses as modern inventions, but the Turnpike avoided Clitheroe almost 200 years before the present A59 was built. Byng took the right-hand option, and what does he say? And here I contrived as usual to miss my road, from not deigning to ask the way, and went 2 miles about to Clitheroe. He never really intended to visit the town, but there he would make an overnight stay. We can follow his route on old maps, but would have some difficulty travelling his road today, as it simply doesn't exist. In the 1970s, the road disappeared to create this. The huge Hanson cement quarry, continuing the extraction of limestone that has been a major industry here for centuries. We can rejoin Byng's route on the other side of the quarry, but as we continue on into Clitheroe, let's just consider the maps available to Byng. In his description of an earlier ride, Byng writes, "I travel by map, for none can inform you, the only people who become acquainted with counties are tourists or canvassers in a general election." Well, that map maker of genius, the Ordnance Survey, had only just begun its work on its triangulation of Great Britain, and had yet to produce any maps. But there was a surprising number of maps available to travellers at Byng's time. For those who simply wished to follow a particular turnpike road, there were the strip maps produced by John Senex, such as this 1757 York to Lancaster route. Some versions also showed suitable inns for accommodation along the way, and the sites of great houses of note. Byng used The Traveller's Companion by John Rock and Robert Sayer of 1786. Here's Rock's map of North Yorkshire. He also used Bowles' New Pocket Guide through England and Wales, 1780. Now, one of the finest mapmakers of the time was John Carey, whose maps of Yorkshire and Lancashire had just been published at the time of Byng's ride. And now we're dropping into the centre of Clitheroe, an ancient borough, and here is Market Place, though the traditional market is now held elsewhere in the town. It's a lovely place, and now a desirable place to live, but what did Byng have to say about Clitheroe? He remarked that the old castle remains and high-standing church make it appear to advantage, whereas it is one of the meanest borough towns. Oh dear, I think he was still oppressed by the weather, but his cold and his accommodation didn't help. The Swan Inn, a poor alehouse, received us, when Garwood, his manservant, was much out of humour at the stable and said, "Let us go on, sir." But Byng's horse needed reshoeing, so they stayed. Broiled and buttered mutton chops, but luckily there was a round of cold beef and a good fire, for it is very cold. My bedchamber was wretched, with an old broken deal door, which I fortified with chairs, and through which every passenger might see me in bed. The Swan Inn is now the Swan and Royal, and as Sir Winston Churchill was a guest during the Second World War, it must have improved. During the war, contracts were signed here to set up factories, for the building of Frank Whittle's first jet engines in Clitheroe and Barnoldswick. The Norman castle dominates the town. Byng respected its solidity and the view from the ramparts. Both it and its grounds have been in public ownership since it was acquired by the people of Clitheroe to stand, in its entirety, as a war memorial. What a great idea, and what an asset to the town. Besides the castle and its range of buildings, there is another interesting structure within the castle grounds. It's a pinnacle from the roof of the Houses of Parliament, gifted to the town by its then MP, Sir William Brass, to commemorate the coronation of King George VI in 1937. The local civic society completed a wonderful conservation of the monument a few years ago, and it now looks splendid. The first cotton mill was built here in 1782, and at the industry's height there were 16 around the town, running thousands of looms. Child labour was a key element in the factories of Byng's day. They could be working from the age of 4. But with the Factories Act in 1819, that was raised to the dizzy heights of 9 years old, and they only had to work for 12 hours a day. One of the people that Byng met on this ride, a Mr Blakey, told him of the wonderful importation into the factories of the north of children purchased in London at so much the half score, that is, 9 sound and 1 cripple. Just 5 years before Byng's visit, in 1787, the following advert appeared in the Manchester Mercury. Wanted immediately at Clitheroe Cotton Mill, children who perfectly understand spinning cotton twist. Clitheroe was home to one or two interesting people. Dr. John Webster, 1610 to 1682, writer, sacked clergyman, headmaster of the local grammar school, physician, chemist with interest in astrology and the occult, and he was very argumentative and controversial in his views. James King, born here in 1750, sailed with Captain James Cook, and was there when Cook was killed in Hawaii, later writing the official account of his commander's death in the bestseller of 1784. A music hall, radio and TV star of the 1940s through to the 1970s, Jimmy Clitheroe was born here, though he and his mother quickly left to move to the nearby village of Blacko. It was Sunday, 24th of June 1792, when Byng rode up Pendle Road to meet the turnpike and travel on to Whalley. His horse was newly shod, but he would find that work badly done, as within a week 1 or more shoes had become loose, necessitating another visit to a blacksmith. So much for Clitheroe. He'd now been on the road 1 month, not a month of cake and candle, but a month of pleasant observation. I've already mentioned that his job in the stamp office of the Inland Revenue was something of a sinecure. His income from that was about £800 per annum, plus he had his army pension. That has an equivalent purchasing power of some £250,000 today. No wonder he could indulge his annual rides around Britain. As we drive along an abandoned part of his turnpike, let's have a brief look at the arts in 1792. I've already mentioned the visual and poetic art of the sublime, but in the theatre, Byng could have seen The Irishman in London, or The Happy African, or Wild Oats by John O'Keeffe, or even Shakespeare's bloody play Coriolanus, which was also resurrected this year, its bloodiness perhaps reflecting what was happening across in France. Musically, the music of Johann Christian Bach, 11th son of Johann Sebastian, and known as London Bach, was still current, though he'd just died. Handel's music too, though he'd died 30 years before. Beethoven had not yet exploded onto the music scene, he was still a student under Haydn. But around the country, in homes and at gatherings, there was one tune that had already been around for many years. It had appeared in John Gay's Beggar's Opera in 1728 and was still popular, and has had many different sets of words. Down yonder green valley, where streamlets meander, when twilight is fading, I pensively rove, or at the bright noontide, in solitude wander, amidst the dark shades of the lonely ash grove. Byng liked Whalley. It's a pretty village with 2 good-looking inns, the Swan particularly so, but no person will give you this information, nor can you get any hint after you've left London. He visited the ruined abbey, of course, comments on the noble gatehouse, and visits the noble relics of the church, all of which have antiquities sufficient to amuse the tourist or supply employ for the painter. He also mentions visiting a folly on Clark Hill, Justice Waller's pleasure house. That stood as a ruin until 1948, when the owner of the land asked the Royal Engineers to blow it up. Byng grumbled that Mr Waller had, with miserable intention, built some strange ruins on a hilltop. And with that, Byng rode off towards Haslingden, eventually arriving home in London on the 17th of July, after a ride covering over 900 miles in his tour to the north. Well, here we are sat in the grounds of Whalley Abbey, and I hope you've enjoyed our travel along with John Byng between Ingleborough and Whalley Nab. John Byng would inherit the title of Lord Torrington just before he died in 1813. His was a Britain moving quickly to an industrialised economy, losing its food security, seeing the rise of romanticism, of people power, of a push against the slave trade and a push for women's rights. All these lead on to where we are today.